Hello, welcome to the interview here on France 24. I'm Douglas Herbert. Is the tide beginning to turn in the fight against the deadliest Ebola outbreak in history? Well, groups such as Doctors Without Borders are saying that they suddenly have more beds than patients in West Africa. That's where the disease has killed more than 5,000 people, infected in excess of 14,000 since the latest outbreak erupted in August. Now, Liberia, where the first cases were detected, recently lifted its state of emergency. But officials warn that despite some positive signs, the threat from Ebola is far from over, and the total number of cases continues to rise. Now, they include my guest today, David Nabarro. He's a medical doctor. He's also the man the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, has tasked with fighting the epidemic. He joins us from Geneva. Dr. Nabarro, thanks for being with me today on the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you. Cutting right to the chase, you said in some comments last week that you see some good signs in the fight against Ebola. But then in the next breath, you added that the results are still uneven among affected countries and even within them. Where at this hour, as we speak, do you see still the greatest threat?
Well, thanks very much indeed. I want to start by stressing that this is an enormous disease outbreak affecting at least 3 countries and now a 4th country in West Africa. And it's a threat to the whole world, but particularly to the continent of Africa. So when we start talking about positive news, it has to be put against the context of a problem that is still very serious. There are some parts of the affected countries which are beginning to show a reduction in the number of cases emerging each week. And these are the areas where the strategy to try to control the outbreak has been implemented particularly well. There are other parts of the same countries that are still showing high rates of transmission. And in addition, there's a need to be vigilant in neighboring countries because, as we've seen, the disease has recently spread. So to be precise, some signs of improvement in parts of Liberia. In Sierra Leone, continuing high rates of transmission, particularly in the west of the country. In Guinea, in parts of the east of the country, also high rates of transmission. And there is now worries about some cases appearing in Mali, which is the most recent new epicenter.
Are most of the improvements in the progress, if you will, in the fight, mostly being seen in the urban areas and the capitals of these countries? Is there a sort of dichotomy between the rural areas and the urban areas?
Well, actually, the improvements are most occurring in areas where communities have taken responsibility to act, indeed to change their behavior in the face of the threat of Ebola. And I have noticed it most pronounced in some of the rural areas, particularly of Liberia and Sierra Leone. In urban areas, it's rather patchy. Some parts of urban areas are okay. Other parts are still showing quite high rates of transmission. But the key determinant is the community owning the issue and actually changing its behavior?
And this
then
is
attached to that.
No, I'm sorry. I wanted to speak directly to that issue you just mentioned because we heard a lot in the past about a lot of local populations. You weren't just fighting the disease, you were fighting their fear of medical treatment. Are you seeing those attitudes changing?
Well, the most important thing is that people everywhere are beginning to understand the kinds of behaviors that lead to the risk of getting the disease, such as practices in funerals where the body is touched and washed laboriously, or also healing practices that are associated with a lot of touching as well. And by recognizing that these can be dangerous, communities have adapted their practices, and that's in turn led to a reduction in transmission. They've also adopted safer burial practices overall, and they are beginning to find ways of isolating people when sick, indeed trying to get them under treatment. So altogether, these are the kind of changes that are leading to reduced rates of infection.
And so that's what I was asking you, really. You're seeing less distrust of foreign medical workers coming into these communities to try to help.
Well, I want to stress that when a community is taking ownership of the issue, They actually are adopting their own responses to the problem. The issue with regard to international personnel has generally not been a major problem. By and large, international personnel and indeed national responders have been accepted into communities once the communities realise that they're coming to help. The bigger issue has always been that communities haven't fully understood what the disease is all about, and fear leading to sometimes slightly violent behaviour is usually as a result of uncertainty and upset because of the lack of understanding about the disease.
So more understanding about the disease itself in these countries. You spoke last week, I believe, about the UN needing, the figure you put on it was about $1.5 billion now through March 2015 to play its role in the fight. You are hundreds of millions of dollars short, I believe, right now. Where are you going to be getting that money?
Well, actually, the situation is not too bad for the United Nations and indeed for the wider response, but it's not yet fully funded. So let me be precise. When we initially appealed in September this year, we asked for nearly $1 billion for the United Nations. We revised that appeal upwards to $1.5 billion once we'd got a bigger assessment of the absolute magnitude of the problem. Thus far, we've received nearly $900 million in response to that appeal. The gap is about $600 million, and we need that so that we can sustain the effort right through into next year, when we will need to do intensive work to move towards the last case and the end of transmission, which is absolutely key to get Ebola out of the affected countries. I am actually confident that the money will come, but I would like to stress we are going to still need resources through into next year to maintain the fight.
Sir, you're a medical doctor yourself. Now, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, they said early on they admitted they underestimated the need for a vaccine to fight Ebola. Do you share that view? And if so, are we any closer to a vaccine?
A vaccine is a very helpful extra tool in the control effort for any major disease like this, because by having a vaccine, you can, first of all, make it easier for health personnel to operate in environments where the disease is prevalent, and secondly, you can also facilitate the control efforts. You still need the other responses that we're doing at the moment, but it's hugely useful in a major outbreak like this. We are now seeing 2 candidate vaccines being subject to clinical trials. If those trials are successful, we anticipate that the vaccines will be available for commercial use during 2015. If we are fortunate and the outbreak is under control early in 2015, we won't need the vaccines this time round. But it will make a huge difference to future battles against Ebola, a virus that will come back again because it's naturally occurring in wild animals, which means that from time to time it will affect the human population.
And I'll remind our viewers, as you well know, Ebola, we knew about it as far back as 1976. I've heard some reports recent days of the possibility of a mutation in the virus becoming more resistant. How would that affect the fight against the disease going ahead?
There's always a danger in any virus of a possible mutation that affects its infectivity or even affects the extent to which it can cause disease and death. The mutation can go either way. It can reduce the seriousness of the virus, or it can make it worse. At the moment, we have no evidence that there has been a mutation of the virus in this outbreak.
How confident are you right now? You mentioned this, you touched on it a few minutes ago, that you can check the spread of Ebola beyond the 3 core countries where we've seen the most cases to other parts of Africa and even beyond Africa to the rest of the world?
It's very clear that this outbreak is a threat not only to Africa but to the whole world. And that's because if the virus gets into other parts of the world that perhaps do not have health systems that are able to defend the people against the virus and its impacts, then that in turn could lead to a major outbreak occurring in another location. So we really are working very hard to try to contain the disease where it is at the moment. During recent weeks, we've seen cases come into other countries, into Nigeria, where it's been contained, and into Senegal, where it's been contained. More recently, it's come into Mali, and we're currently mobilizing a major effort to try to make sure that it does not get embedded in Mali and that Mali does not become another country which we say is seriously affected.
Finally, sir, in the little time we have left, you said last week the threat that Ebola poses to the region, to the world, will not be over until the last case is identified, isolated, and under treatment. When might that be? Briefly.
Of course, all of us would love it to be as soon as possible that the last case is identified and treated. But we really cannot predict when it's going to be. The most optimistic projection is in the middle of next year. It could be longer, and I am not in a position at this stage to say when. I'm just hoping it comes as quickly as possible, because this disease is causing terrible suffering and having a long-term impact on the affected countries. What we need to do is to get it under control, end the outbreak, and then help the countries get back to where they were and the people to be strong all over again.
David Nabarro, a special envoy, United Nations, a special envoy to the Secretary General on the Ebola epidemic. Thank you for joining us today. We'll end it on those fighting but positive words. And thanks to all of you for watching the interview here on France 24. More news ahead.